Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are going to get started in just about 30 seconds. Thank you so much for being here today. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. We are going to get started in just about 15 seconds. All right, there's some folks still jumping in, but we are going to get started. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Indiana Youth Institute's webinar, Overcoming the Stigma of Youth Mental Illness. My name is Joshua Long, and I'm the Educational Content Manager at IYI. We are so glad you joined us for today's presentation, and we are grateful to have the chance to connect as a community of Indiana youth workers that remain committed to meeting the needs of our youth and children. For those who are not familiar with IYI, our mission is to improve the lives of all Indiana children by strengthening and connecting the people, organizations, and communities that are focused on kids and youth. Listed here, you can see the values that drive the work we do for Indiana youth. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few pointers that will help you engage with today's webinar before introducing the speaker. And as I'm doing the technical support slide, if some folks have already started, but if you could go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, that would be really helpful for the networking piece. Additionally, the chat is where you can ask questions in addition to the Q&A tab. For any technical support issues, use the chat feature to send a message, and Aaron Whitcomb, IYI's registration manager, is behind the scenes to assist you. Use this feature to converse with the group as well. You can also download, you'll be able to access today's PowerPoint in an email that'll be sent after. We encourage you to ask questions, so please use the Q&A feature for any you may have, and we will get to as many as possible. Feel free to also upvote great questions to the top. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know your thoughts about today's presentation. And if you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk email as it may have been directed there. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of participation. Like all of IYI's webinars, today's webinar will be posted on our website if you'd like to revisit a portion later or share the opportunity to listen with partners. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Lindsay Kuzy is an LMHC and certified as a compassion fatigue professional, advanced grief counseling specialist, and level 2 clinical trauma professional. Lindsay is also a QPR gatekeeper instructor and CAMS trained therapist. She received her MA in clinical psychology from the University of Indianapolis. Lindsay began her career working with individuals as a dual diagnosis of intellectual disability or autism and a mental health diagnosis. She went on to create and direct the Intensive Behavioral Intervention Program and Outpatient Clinic at DeMar Services. She briefly returned to the Medicaid waiver, directing the behavior management program for Indiana Mentor before supervising school-based services with Aspire, a community mental health center. She has been the Education Behavioral Health Coordinator for Cummins Behavioral Health System since November 2021, and recently added the title of Child Resiliency Program Manager. Lindsay also has a practice space, LJK Counseling, where she provides therapy services as well as mental health training and consulting. We look forward to today's presentation, so let's get started. Lindsay?
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here today talking to you about how we can reduce stigma of mental health diagnosis and treatment. As we prepare these trainings, it's really hard to kind of talk through the full gamut of everybody that I see that's participating today. So we're trying to talk through this from ways that you, if you're an expert in this area, could also take this and talk with other people. It's also a way that if you're not an expert in this area, that you could take this and talk to other people as well. So I'm really excited to be here today presenting this. As Josh mentioned, I have a lot of experience in multiple areas where there is a lot of stigma in the work that we did, especially with those with special needs and mental health at the same time. One of the biggest barriers to treatment for many of our youth in particular is this idea of stigma, the stigma that comes with mental health, not only for the child, but for the parent. The work that I do in my full-time job is just that. I provide education to school staff and those working with students on mental health topics, as well as in my private practice, in the hope that we can reduce some of these barriers and stigmas so that our students, especially our youth, especially, can start to really get a grasp on this mental health epidemic that we're in right now. So before we start, I'd like to hear what you have to say. When you hear the words mental health, what comes to mind? And I'll give about a minute for people to pop in here and chat about what they think of when you hear the words mental health. Self-help books, stress, self-care, therapy, struggling, are thoughts healthy, struggle with emotion regulation, medication, some sort of diagnosis. We all have it. Emotional needs, therapy, depression, lack of motivation, extra support, stigma, different than normal. These are all great. Emotional instability. How am I approaching my day? When you're not okay, youth trauma, substances, mental wellness, new definition of normal. I like that. Something's wrong with you. Key part of health. Yeah. Need for more early education on it. Yeah. Yeah. I love all the differences in the idea when we hear this, because that's exactly the point, right? We're seeing some positives to this, but we're also seeing some negatives. Expensive, but necessary. Advocate. Be the able, not disable. Many people underestimate it. I really appreciate all of this. Please keep going so you can share with each other. A lot of times when somebody hears that mental health, it's usually not positive. It's usually because we're struggling, as somebody said. It's therapy, it's something's wrong with you, it's mental illness, right? When we hear mental health, it's not in the same connotation as we think of when we think of physical health, right? Physical health is something we all should do. It's something that in society we look at. If you're physically healthy, you're more attractive, right? Physical health is something to strive for. Why isn't mental health something we strive for in the same way with the same connotations, right? Self-care, when people talk about self-care by working out, that's a great thing. But when we talk about self-care in the way we talk about meditation, people think that's way on that, that is way new age. I'm not doing that. So there's lots of different ways that we can start to look at how mental health, just that word in and of itself, can create stigma as we talk through some of these next things. So objectively today, what we're going to talk about, we're going to define what stigma is. Given the topics, the time we have today, it's going to be a broader overview. We're highlighting the way that Children's Health really identified ways to reduce stigma. I really liked the way they put these 5 together. There's a lot of ways we can reduce stigma. A lot of them really are this same general idea that Children's Health had put together. It's looking at reducing stigma in much the same way. So we're going to identify it in 5 ways that we're going to work to end stigma and how we can take that out into the communities we work with. Why is this so important to talk about? Well, in the 10 years leading up to the pandemic, feelings of persistent sadness and hopelessness have increased. Our Gen Z generation, that iGen generation, since social media and phones have come out, it's increasing depression, anxiety rates, suicide rates in a way that we've never seen before. Our children are living through unprecedented times. The Surgeon General just declared that youth mental health is something that we really need. I believe he called it an epidemic at this point. I just received an email yesterday that CAMS and QPR, which are both suicide prevention and suicide therapy protocols, are partnering because there needs to be an increase in the awareness and prevention practices for our youth. These words have become normalized in conversations as well as on television. These have been used when talking about someone with mental illness or to describe abnormal behavior. You're acting crazy, right? Words like this can promote stigma. Nobody wants to be associated with these words. You go to therapy because you're crazy, or they were acting psycho, right? Those are the pieces that we're battling when we come up against stigma. We also have our implicit bias that's been affected by those things we see around us. For many people, what they think they know of mental illness is what they've been shown in movies, on TV shows, etc. Now, things are being represented better, but take a look at the beginning of this video. on what we've been immersed to in video, in movies, and in television over the last handful of years, multiple handful of years.
The perception of mental illness in the form of visual media has had a very complex and varied history. Usually, these storylines are told through a very dramatized, inaccurate, and sometimes romanticized way, which further creates negative stereotypes and perceptions of mental illnesses, psychiatric hospitals, medication, and therapists. What's most commonly seen in forms of media is mental illness being used in the horror or psychological thriller genre. Mental illnesses in these genres aren't anything new, as it's seen most famously in Alfred Hitchcock's 1960s Psycho. Throughout the years, this has become more common in films, and individuals with mental illnesses in horror-type films are usually seen as the villain, dangerous, or a harm to others. This categorization only serves to further stigmatize mental health as well as individuals who are diagnosed with a mental illness. Most of the time, the symptoms of mental illnesses are exaggerated for a film, which can further confuse the general public, especially if they are only made aware of certain mental illnesses through visual mediums and have no connection with an actual person who has a mental illness. This narrative can be seen in the 2016 film Split. Before Split was released, there were already articles that discussed the fact that dissociative identity disorder, or DID, was being misrepresented in this film. DID is a disorder in which an individual has at least two distinct personality identities.
So Dr. Westers is a clinical psychologist at Children's Health, and he said mental health problems are often portrayed incorrectly in movies and TV, as we just saw. They can paint characters struggling with a mental health problem as incompetent or even violent. So stigma is defined as a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. So let's dive into this a little bit more. This is out of Canada, but I feel it really gets to the heart of what stigma is and how people may feel when talking about mental health. So let's take a look at how we can reduce stigma after we take a look at this video.
Have you ever felt left out or judged by people because they thought you were different from them? Maybe you've been discriminated against. How did this affect you? Maybe you felt misunderstood, embarrassed, alone, or even afraid. That is what stigma might feel like. So what is stigma? Stigma is a set of negative beliefs and prejudices about a group of people. Stigma also includes negative behaviors towards groups of people. Many people face stigma because of their race, religion, sexuality, gender, economic situation, and a variety of other things. People living with mental illnesses often face stigma and discrimination. This can make them feel ashamed, hopeless, distressed, reluctant to get help or accept help, and feel like they are to blame for their illness. In fact, almost half of Canadians thought people use the term mental illness as an excuse for bad behavior, and 27% say they would be fearful of being around someone who has a serious mental illness. Why is that? Well, many years ago, mental illnesses were not well understood. We didn't know how mental illnesses influenced a person's brain or affected their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. People with mental illnesses were not treated with the support they needed and were considered outcasts or even dangerous. To end stigma, people need to understand and accept that mental illnesses are like any other health conditions and need the right treatment. We would never say to someone, just think positively and your diabetes will go away. But how many times have you heard, try to be happy, think positively, don't be so depressed. You have so many good things in your life. Now let's look at an example of how stigma can hurt someone. Stefan is a first-year university student. He likes his program and has some new friends. However, Stefan feels stressed and overwhelmed by all of his schoolwork and being away from home. He's not feeling like himself, and most days he doesn't want to get out of bed. He's afraid his friends will think he's weak if he tells them, and he doesn't want anyone seeing him at the clinic, so he doesn't reach out for help on campus. His feelings get worse, and he's having a hard time staying in school. Like with Stefan, the stigma people experience often prevents them from getting help and support from family, friends, and professionals.
So we saw in the video that this individual didn't want others to know. He hid his symptoms, prevented him from being able to adapt healthy behaviors. We want to reduce stigma because it allows us to focus on the people versus the disease that's causing the problem. It can help people want to hide symptoms of illness. And if we can reduce stigma, then they can maybe get better and seek out that help. And we can help them to adopt healthy behaviors. So the first step on our journey is to educate yourself and the people we work with about mental health. Mental illness it's hard to find that PC term for mental health because it's called a diagnosis, it's called a mental illness, right? There's all of these connotations that come with having this. So that's part of it, right? We as therapists have the DSM and so it comes from that. But mental illness in general are thought to be caused by a variety of genetic and environmental factors. There's inherited traits that mental illness is more common in people whose blood relatives also have a diagnosis. Certain genes may increase your risk of developing a mental health disorder, and your life situation may trigger it. There's environmental exposures before birth, exposures to things like inflammatory conditions, toxins, alcohol, or drugs while in the womb can be linked to mental illness. And then there's brain chemistry. Neurotransmitters are naturally occurring brain chemicals that carry signals to other parts of your brain and body. And when those neural networks involving these chemicals are impaired, the function of nerve receptors and nerve systems change, leading to depression and other emotional disorders. What this is saying is this is something that, like we said they said in the video, we can't just say, think positive and you'll feel better, right? We're seeing that these are things similar to diabetes or heart disease, right? These are things that we're saying are coming from the environment or coming from our genetics. It's not necessarily something that we can just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and feel better. There are many types of mental health problems, and we're going to talk about the most common in the next few slides because, as we just said, educating ourselves about mental health is understanding what these diagnoses really mean. So a mental health diagnosis is a health condition that changes a person's thinking, feeling, or behavior, or all three. And this is important. It causes the person distress and difficulty functioning. Approximately 12 million children under the age of 18 have a diagnosed mental illness or disorder. I'm thinking it's more than that, but we're not getting them in to see people, right? This is about 1 in 5 children at any time. Many of them don't receive services or help with their mental health problems. In IYI State of the Child, they noted there's 1 mental health professional for every 560 persons in the state of Indiana. That's a lot, right? We can't carry a caseload of 560 people, even if everybody needed therapy. So part of our barrier is services may not be applicable to every place that we're at, as well as the stigma of getting help and what that looks like, right? So let's start first with trauma. And I'm saying trauma, not PTSD, because there's a difference. To be diagnosed with PTSD, there's a specific event that is accompanied with it. That doesn't mean with somebody with trauma doesn't have difficulty coping or look like somebody who might have PTSD. It's just the way that it's defined in our DSM, which is our diagnostic manual. Single trauma are those events that are singular or unpredictable in intervals. They're real or perceived threats to life, safety, and physical integrity. Complex trauma is probably what a lot of our youth that we work with see. It's developmental environments that train reactions and responses that become characteristics of themselves. Events become traumatic because it overwhelms our brain's capacity to cope. It's a sensory experience. It's not logical. Anxiety. I feel like Dr. Faith Harper has this really nailed. It's a full body disequilibrium that demands immediate attention and corrective action. We all have worry thoughts. Anxiety is necessary, right? Getting up to talk in front of the many people that are on here today and creating this program causes anxiety, and it's good, right? I should have that. I should have that level going into this. It's that next level where your body demands that action. If you've ever had that feeling maybe of dis-ease where you're like, did I lock the door? Or maybe it was a beautiful day outside and you went to work and your windows were down and then it starts raining. You're like, did I close my windows? And it's that feeling or that need to look, to go see, to go act. That's what somebody with anxiety is feeling consistently all the time. There's that constant state of dis-ease where they have to act or feel like their skin is crawling almost because there's so much worry thought going on inside their head. According to the National Institutes of Health, nearly 1 in 3 of all adolescents ages 13 to 18 will experience an anxiety disorder. The CDC reports 9.4% of our youth are experiencing this at this time. And this is, I believe this is the highest that we see as we go through some of the prevalence rates that we'll go through next. So depression is a mood disorder that causes a persistent feeling of sadness and loss of interest. It affects your whole body, physically, emotionally, all of it. Along with ADHD, behavior problems, and anxiety, depression is one of the most commonly diagnosed mental health disorders in children. And they're reporting, the CDC reports it about 4.4% of our youth. Oppositional defiant disorder is a little bit of a shift. It's a behavior disorder where children show symptoms of being uncooperative, defiant, hostile towards peers, parents. This is not just a disobedient child who needs some boundaries. This is a child that there's a bigger underlying reason that they're engaging in these behaviors. There's some pieces to this that are a little bit different. And we'll look at that in a few slides too of what this looks like. But this is what we're looking at when we talk about a behavior disorder. And as I mentioned, along with ADHD, depression, and anxiety, these are one of the most commonly diagnosed mental health disorders at 8.9% of our youth. So when we look at depression, anxiety, behavior disorders, all by age, you can see anxiety is one of the top, especially for those ages 12 to 17, which makes a lot of sense, right? Middle school is hard. High school, we've got the stress of what are we doing next? It makes a lot of sense. Behavior disorders as well, because those are things that we have to consistently work through and continually work through with our youth. And depression, again, as we hit those 12 to 17 years and we're going through puberty and all of those pieces change of what our minds are thinking about, right? Our social interactions are so much more important and it's taken so much more emotionally. We can see where these, especially depression and anxiety, can show those increases at those ages. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So this is a little bit different. And this can cause trouble with paying attention, controlling impulse behavior. Really, this is neurodivergence. It's a different way that the brain works for them. And I hate that this is called a disorder because for many people with ADHD, there are really amazing strengths that come from the way that their brain works. And I think we're seeing more of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about neurodivergence in just a second. But I really think that using that word is a way that we can reduce stigma, especially for ADHD. So at first glance, this can really describe so many students, especially boys. Controlling impulse behaviors can be normal in young people. Their prefrontal cortex is not yet developed. Along with some other diagnostic criteria, typically symptoms need to be present before the age of 12 for ADHD. Again, it's one of the most common childhood disorders, slightly higher than anxiety at 9.8%. So here's that neurodivergence. The term neurodivergent came from the related term neurodiversity. Judy Singer, an Australian sociologist, coined the word neurodiversity in 1998. It really has just kind of taken off in the last number of years. This was to recognize that everyone's brains develop in a unique way. It's ways to start to reduce stigma for especially the individuals with the diagnoses listed on the screen. It's not a medical term. It's a way to describe people other than normal or abnormal. And that's important because there's no single definition of normal for how our brain works. So being able to use this to say their brains work in a different way, and that's beautiful. And how do we help them to live life with the brains the way that they work? So autism spectrum disorder is one of those that fall under this. And I bring this up because autism spectrum disorder has expanded under the most recent DSM that has come out. It is an umbrella for multiple terms that we used to use separately: Asperger's, pervasive developmental disorder. All of those pieces are now under this umbrella. So educating ourselves on mental health, getting a brief overview of how prevalent these diagnoses are, as well as understanding a little bit about what they do in our bodies, is that first step in helping to reduce stigma. So we're going to talk about the range of symptoms. So we just talked about the prevalence. Now let's talk about the range and what this looks like, because we're going to see through these next few slides, there is so much overlap. When we look at ADHD and trauma, could this be a learning disability? Are we fidgeting out of fear or nerves when they're not understanding? Kids will cover up to hide shame and embarrassment. As you can see here, there are about the same number of shared symptoms as there are individual symptoms for ADHD and trauma. So when we as mental health professionals begin working with an individual, the history is so important because it helps us learn which direction we can go in regard to treatment. A lot of times the skills we're treating and we're working on in both of these situations are going to help the student, whether it's trauma or ADHD. But it's really important to see this wide range of symptoms that are coming up. Again, ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, lots and lots of overlap here. The function behind the behaviors here are really what's important as we discern what is at the heart of the symptoms. Depression and anxiety, these two overlap so much that depression can have a clarifier called anxious features when we're doing a diagnosis, which just adds that layer. And again, as we begin working with somebody, identifying, are these more worry-based causing the depression, or is it more depression leading to the worry? Both of these diagnoses have a lot of somatic symptoms. This, I think, is one thing that if you take away today, understanding that somatic symptoms are probably one of the most difficult things for families working with the youth to handle. If they say their stomach hurts, the doctor says nothing's wrong, and the family isn't looking deeper into the feelings because mental health is a stigma, they're not looking into those feelings or those thoughts. When there's a stomach ache that happens, it can lead to shame and lack of appropriate resources for that youth. So these two especially, it's really important that we understand what's happening behind some of those somatic pieces. Lots and lots of crossover here. It can be really difficult to decipher between these two diagnoses. And that is really hard because there are greater resources available for a child with autism spectrum disorder than a child with ADHD. I'm not saying that individuals are being diagnosed at a greater rate of service at all, but I'm just recognizing that there's a profound overlap here. And again, they both fall under the neurodivergent umbrella. So is this just ways that we can relook at how their brains are working so that we can work together with them in ways that work for them? ADHD and anxiety, about 3 in 10 children with ADHD were also diagnosed with anxiety. Again, profound overlap here. A child who's easily distracted could have chronic anxiety, or it could be ADHD. So again, it's identifying, are these more worries? Where are they coming from? What does this look like deep down? So now we've gone through 2, right? We are having more awareness about what these diagnoses look like and the prevalence of them. And now we've also looked at number 2, how wide of range these symptoms can be and how much overlap there can be. So how do we go on to this next one of listening and supporting others with mental health concerns? How can we have open conversations about mental health? One way to normalize mental health is to read books about it, using appropriate feeling words and using person-first language. Another way to do this is by increasing one's own emotional intelligence. Without the awareness that comes with emotional intelligence, it can be difficult to recognize the need to talk to others, just like we saw in the video at the beginning. Many call emotional intelligence a soft skill, and I'm going to argue that the lack of these soft skills are the reason we're seeing so many students struggling in high school and college right now. Many of our students are lacking emotional intelligence in the way that older generations did not. Some of this is from the pandemic. Some of this is technology. Some of this is due to being adolescents. But we're seeing a decline in what abilities emotionally that our students can have. So emotional intelligence is the ability to use, understand, and manage emotion in a productive and healthy way. It helps communicate effectively, empathize, and overcome challenges. And EQ is learned through observing voices and body postures and facial expressions. So Daniel Goleman really introduced the mixed model of what emotional intelligence looks like. He has a book that he wrote, I believe in the 90s, that is called emotional intelligence and starts this whole conversation. Really, he breaks this down into these 5 pieces: self-awareness, knowing your feelings, understanding your emotional triggers, and knowing how to deal with them. Right? If we can identify those things, if we have that piece, then that's us overcoming some of the stigma to be aware that I need help with this. Just like I'd need help if I broke my arm, I need help with what's going on in my awareness of my feelings right now. Same with self-management, keeping emotions in check when they're disruptive. Motivation, high EQ is intrinsically motivated. I talk to a lot of staff working in schools, and man, motivation is one of the top things that we're talking about right now. Empathy and support for others. Communication is the ability to communicate with people in person. So again, going back to the video that we saw at the beginning, it's the communication piece that is holding up that student from seeking services and falling into the hole of further depressive symptoms and being able to function at school. So if we built some of this self-awareness, if we built some of this self-management, and if we built empathy that we could support others' emotions without calling them soft, right? That's a stigma in itself. We don't want to be soft. Then maybe that student would be able to get the help that they need and move forward. So there's another piece when we talk about emotional intelligence is we have to talk about vulnerability. Being able to talk with someone requires us to be vulnerable. So we need to start teaching emotional intelligence and teaching vulnerability because they need that self-awareness so they can communicate their needs. Just like if their stomach's hurting, they can say, I'm having worry thoughts, or I'm identifying that in my body, I don't feel sick, but my stomach hurts and I have a test coming up. Putting these things together to equate what's happening in my body and what's happening outside of it. Social connection requires us to be vulnerable. And this has been tough when there's a screen or device between us, right? Brene Brown and Daring Greatly defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Huge. Vulnerability is difficult. It's the core of all emotions and feelings. To feel is to be vulnerable. So if we're going to work with our youth on reducing stigma, we have to normalize talking about feelings in a positive way. Again, we're not saying that your feelings allow you to behave in a certain way without consequence, but it is saying that feelings are valid and that more conversation may be needed with that person to understand them, to resolve your feelings, to go into a difficult conversation, but to hear each other out. So now we're seeing if you hurt my feelings, I'm cutting you off. We're not even having a conversation. And that's not building our emotional intelligence to, I don't have to agree with you, but maybe if we have a conversation, we can understand where each other's coming from. So one way, again, to normalize mental health is to read books about it, use appropriate feeling words, and use person-first language, which we'll talk about next. Keeping in mind with vulnerability, ways to implement this with our youth or with your teams is what's called a 2-word check-in. And this is something that, again, Brene Brown had introduced, or you could use zones. So in this check-in, you're simply asking for these feeling words or the zone they're in. And this gives an idea of where they're going into their time with you. And it gives you an idea of where you need to check in. It helps everybody to know, maybe we need to work on some coping, or maybe we need to ground today before we get started on whatever we're working on. It's helping them to recognize when I feel this way, I can do this to be able to be present and okay to learn or work. And it's okay to feel red today. We don't have to be happy and joyful and green all the time. But green means we're ready to learn. We're ready to be present in the moment. But we don't have to be happy, right? We can just be okay and still be in green. So I invite you, as we do this poll, let me see if I can get this up. What zone are you in this moment? To remind of the things we just talked about, these are ways we can support individuals to be present and support those who have mental health concerns, because they can sit in feelings with them. They have the EQ to work with that. The person can help those feelings, words, help feel validated, and it's a step towards destigmatizing. I love the answers here. There's some yellow, there's some blue, there's some green, and that's good. If we were in a group together, those of you in yellow, we may ask for more information, or it may be something that I know to go check in with you later. If you're in blue, again, it might be the same thing because you might be saying you're tired. Well, what happened last night? Did something happen at home, right? It's those places you can go back and you can check in. I'm really glad to see nobody's here and in red right now, because that's good for me. That means that nobody's super upset with what I'm saying. So that's a good thing. So I appreciate you all for participating in that questioning. So another part of being able to talk with somebody about mental health is using person first language. So here are some examples of person first language. When we use person first language, we begin to remove the negative stigma by placing a something on someone. So it helps to be a person identified with, it helps to not be the person identified with X, but rather someone who's working on it, right? So what does this look like? Somebody with depression is somebody that's living with depression or schizophrenia. A person with a substance use challenge or disorder, person with an alcohol use or challenge, person in recovery, mental health challenge or crisis, substance use challenge or crisis, died by suicide. It's not committed suicide anymore. It's somebody that died by suicide or attempted suicide. All of these person first language really help us move to being more strength-based in our words, and it really helps to take the stigma off of what we're saying. So again, I just talked about strengths-based. When we're reducing stigma, it's looking past what's wrong and looking at what's right. So like I mentioned with ADHD, there's a lot of strengths for these individuals. Where are we pulling those in? Using person first language is the first step. Using person first language is the first step. Using strength-based language is the second step. Using strengths-based language along with person first language makes us aware of what we're saying. Remember when we talked about, these words, right? This is not strengths-based. This is not person-centered language. So when we go back to thinking about these strengths, it gives us a mindset to allow us to see the person as more than the diagnosis that they carry. So what does this look like? I love the TED Talk by Rita Pierson, especially on strengths conversations. In that, she gives an example of a test that a student was given. And in that moment, the student received their test back and they got 2 out of 20 right on the test. Many of us would have seen a -18 on the top of a test. Instead, what Rita talks about is she put +2 and a smiley face. And the student says, "Is this an F?" And she says, "Yes." He says, "Why is there a +2 and a smiley face?" And she says, "Because you're on a roll. And when we go through and we work on this together, you're going to remember it. And you're going to remember it because we're coming from a place of building on what they can, right? We're going to work on those pieces of who they are and how we can build coping skills or how we can build strengths around that narrative for that youth. Building a strengths-based narrative changes that narrative, and it provides space for vulnerable conversation and idea sharing. Kids with early trauma history benefit from environments where teachers or caregivers encourage kids to notice and acknowledge strengths in one another. Research also shows this way of communicating provides a positive interaction, which dramatically improves the outlook for children suffering from ACEs. A strengths-based approach to working with these youth is to find the skill that makes them unique. Oftentimes we describe youth with words like distractible or impulsive, manipulative. Instead, they could be spontaneous or bring vitality. Individuals with ADHD are often incredibly creative. When we don't focus on the strengths, it can cause esteem problems, it can pigeonhole labels, and it furthers stigma. So a really big way to reducing stigma is to think of our whole body. Somebody mentioned this in the chat at the beginning when we were talking about mental health, that this is a full body approach. We typically go to the doctor and it's neck down, right? We don't talk about our brains unless we have something physically going on with it, headaches. But if we start to look at our health from a whole body approach, we are much more likely to be kinder when we think about mental health and also make it a focus. And as we'll see in the next few slides, our whole body works together constantly in order to work efficiently. Why wouldn't we do that when we talk about our health? It should just be our health, not physical health or mental health. It's our health. Again, in the video at the beginning, we wouldn't tell someone with diabetes to just think positively and diabetes will go away. Mental health disorders are treatable. And when we come with that frame in mind, mental health problems as treatable, children can start to feel more hopeful about seeking treatment. So remember at the beginning, we talked about genetics and the environmental pieces that are going on. The basic functional unit of our brain is a neuron, and I'm not going to go too deep into this. And this is a specialized cell that can produce different actions because it's precise connections with other neurons, sensory receptors, and muscle cells. Okay, so it communicates using electrical signals. And most scientists believe that mental illness results from problems with the communication between neurons in the brain. If we have that same type of electrical signal problem in other parts of our body, there's other medical diagnoses that we have, and we look at it in a very different way. And so we need to be kind and give ourselves permission when we know that these neurotransmitters aren't working properly to say, we've got to do something to get these back on track. So for example, the level of neurotransmitter serotonin is typically lower in individuals who have depression, which is why we have medication for that illness as a serotonin base. There are really two main classes of neurotransmitters, but that's about as deep as I'm going to go in talking about that conversation. But I do want to highlight a few of the structures of neurotransmitters that we have in our body, because look how many there are, and look how many different things that they do, right? We have adrenaline, which helps with fight, flight, or freeze. It dilates our blood vessels, it dilates our airways, it gets us ready. Dopamine is that association with feelings of pleasure and satisfaction, but if we take it too far, it can become an addiction. Movement and motion are also affected by dopamine. It's to satisfy this person, and we usually repeat behavior so that we can keep getting that dopamine. Serotonin, as we just talked about, is thought to be contributing to feelings of well-being and happiness. It regulates sleep cycle as well as melatonin. It also regulates intestinal movement, right? Exercise can have positive effects on serotonin levels and dopamine levels. Endorphins as well. They're released in the brain during exercise, excitement, pain, and sexual activity, and produce feelings of well-being or even euphoria. There's at least 20 types of endorphins that have been identified in humans, and certain foods such as chocolate and spicy foods can stimulate the release of these. So this is happening all the time in our body, right? And sometimes with different diagnoses that we have, we might not have as much as we need to have. I apologize if you can hear that noise in the background. There's been a lot of research emerging about our gut brain. Our gut does a lot. It's not capable of thoughts, but communicates with our big brain. This gut provides approximately 95% of our total body serotonin. So it's actually not all in our brain, it's in our body. This pathway includes the vagus nerve and the entire nervous system and the activity of neurotransmitters within the GI tract. So understanding with this, what we eat is an important part of our mental health also. Chris Palmer is a Harvard professor and I believe he's a psychiatrist. He was on a podcast recently with Dax Shepard, and they were talking about this gut-brain axis, and they're talking about the research that's moving towards what we eat being as important to our mental health as working out. And again, if we can start having these conversations and destigmatize mental health, that it's just eating well is good for our whole body, our full system, then maybe we can make some changes and strides there. So I do want to talk about self-care, because as we're talking about a full body approach, self-care is really important. If we want to make sure that we're overcoming these mental health challenges and keeping them in check, then self-care is what we look at for this full body approach. And if we're looking at things together, self-care is not just that buzzword. It's something that includes eating right, getting enough sleep, exercising, giving your brain a break, and allowing our bodies to rest. There's 3 central aspects to self-care, which is awareness of our own needs and limits, which a lot of us in the helping profession are not good at, right? We give, and we don't sometimes identify where those limits are. We balance life activities within work and play. And then connection. Connection's the antidote to isolation. So in connection, it doesn't mean I have to go run with 5 people. It doesn't mean I have to go be in a class with somebody. Connection could be, I'm going to go for a run and listen to my Crime Junkie podcast, so that way I can talk about it tomorrow because I know they've already listened to this episode, right? That's connection, knowing that you're going to have that. So that decreases that isolation and increases validation and hope. We've talked about physical self-care and what it can do when we talk about endorphins and ways that we can help boost ourselves. Physical self-care has direct impacts on your emotional, psychological, and spiritual self-care, as well as aerobic exercise doing that. It increases those endorphins like we talked about. It can help have some decreasing effects on anxiety. But the important thing here is you can't just tell somebody, well, go for a run and your depression's going to go away. It might help it. It might start to heal you, but it's not going to make it go away, right? Therapy for anxiety, for all of the diagnoses we talked about, is really, really important because it helps us in conjunction with this physical self-care. It's just like going to the doctor. If you have diabetes, you change that diet, you work with your doctor on your insulin, and you can become healthy inside. Same type of thought process here. And then we have spiritual self-care. And spiritual self-care focuses on meditation and mindfulness. And a lot of times when we say meditation and mindfulness, we get the new age concept. That's new age. But there is a lot of research that's talking about mindfulness reducing the activity in your amygdala. Your amygdala is the part of the brain that turns your stress response on when there's a perceived threat. It's a smoke detector. Just like burning toast in your kitchen, your smoke alarm is going to go off, but there's not a fire, right? But your amygdala, in situations that are very similar to past experiences where you've had to have fight or flight, it remembers that, and in perceived experiences that come forward, it goes off. Mindfulness can help to reduce that activity. So it can help reduce those feelings of being on guard or shaming oneself. Mindfulness is only successful with self-compassion and self-understanding. That's from Singer. It's not about quieting our mind to think of nothing. And that's oftentimes, I think people have the wrong idea. When we talk about mindfulness or meditation, they think of, yoga instructors or people sitting and saying Om, and there's stigma to it, right? There's stigma to it. That's not what it has to be. It can be, but it doesn't have to be there. This topic is really broad. There's a lot of guided meditations that you can engage in and introduce to. But one of those places that we can introduce to our families that may be a good place to start when it comes to mindfulness is just doing 5 senses. So in this moment, when we're working with individuals and trying to help them understand that mindfulness doesn't have to be thinking of nothing, right? We're doing some practice that's helping our body to stop thinking forward or backward so that we can shrink the amygdala. We can do grounding techniques, meditation techniques, and all that's doing is helping us stay present in the moment. So this 5 senses meditation is super easy to do wherever you are, whenever you're somewhere you're starting to feel that lack of grounding, when you're starting to feel your sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight come on. You can do this when you're walking, you can do this when you're resting. It's just taking that moment to notice our surroundings. And so often it's hard to do that because we go to our phones, right? We go to our phones and scroll instead of taking in. So our body is constantly stimulated, but things that we're scrolling and seeing on our phones are lighting up our amygdala. So this 5 senses meditation is super simple. It's 5 things that you see. You look around the room. It's identifying that's a lamp. It's silver and white. That's a TV. It's got a black frame. That's a flower. It's white. That's it. It's looking around and naming those things. Could be in your head. 4 things you hear is identifying those 4 things around you that you can hear. 3 things you feel. I feel my body on the chair. I feel my hair on my neck, and I feel my bracelets on my wrist. 2 things you can smell. And sometimes it might be moving around to smell those things. And that's also mindful meditation because you're moving and you're focused on seeking something that smells good in the moment and something you can taste. It may be that you pop something in your mouth so you have a good taste, or it could be, man, my breakfast was super yummy this morning, so I'm going to remember that. So that's what meditation can be. And again, if we can identify, it's just how we're present around us and what we're being aware of. It doesn't have to be this super quieting, Om experience. It can be, but it can also be this. So if we talk about those things and we talk about ways that we can help ourselves as we move through, it also helps to reduce stigma in things that we're working on with people that we work with. So the last piece here is we're going to share real life examples of people who have mental health disorders. So talking about people that have these diagnoses helps us to not feel so isolated, especially in our culture now where we look so heavily to influencers and athletes and actors and actresses, right? Knowing even these athletes and celebrities struggle can help us in moving and being aware that this is out there everywhere, right? It's not just because of my situation. Somebody like Kristen Bell, who seemingly has it all, can go through anxious and depression states as well. Wow, this does affect everybody. Remember back to those prevalence rates as well. When we think about those real life examples, helping our youth and families understand that 1 in 3 adolescents that are in middle and high school are experiencing some sort of anxiety. Letting people know that this is out there and it's prevalent and it's happening can help to, again, reduce that stigma because we're sharing real life examples. Other places that I feel like it's really important is looking at personal stories. So if you do a quick Google search, you can find all kinds of stories about overcoming mental illness, from athletes and stars to everyday individuals. On the left here is personal stories from the National Alliance on Mental Illness webpage. They have personal stories of people overcoming and finding recovery. This could be through peer groups, hearing stories from other people like them. That's why peer groups are so important when it comes to recovery from the use of substances. Looking at the fact that we've got Olympic athletes that are going through this as well. So to recap, today we've talked about the 5 ways that we can help to end mental health stigma. And we've talked a lot, right? We've talked about ways to educate ourselves. We went through and talked about what diagnoses look like. We talked about the prevalence of those diagnoses. We talked about ways that we can share real life examples with athletes, with people around us, from the website, from stars that are around us. There's influencers that are talking about it. It's on TV in better ways now. I'm a huge Ted Lasso fan, and really they're doing, I feel like, a really good job of bringing to light, especially talking about mental health with men. I think it's been a great way that we can start shifting that conversation. Explaining mental health has a range of symptoms. We talked about that when we talked about all of those pieces that go together. When we see the ADHD and trauma together, how much of their overlap there is and how many symptoms there are to it and what those symptoms can be and the somatic side to it. How we can listen and support others is by building our emotional intelligence, right? Reading books, using feelings, words appropriately, and then sharing those stories of overcoming mental health disorders by talking through how we get help, right? All goes back to those pieces of, we have to be able to have that emotional intelligence that they know they can go and talk to somebody, and that's how we can move forward. Are there questions that I can answer that have come up, Josh or Aaron?
There hasn't been any questions, but there has been some good content in the chat. There was a couple earlier. Keith said, I saw a suspenseful movie where a teen boy was depicted as having behaviors indicating he was mentally unstable. Later, he was identified as the killer and was manipulating way into the neighbor's life by his behaviors. I thought that was like pretty telling of media and your point on that earlier. Holly said, it's interesting on the perspectives of mental illness based on those who have experience in this field versus not having experience. I thought that was pretty interesting, especially because those of us that are sort of in this world, we're thinking about mental health every day. And sometimes at least I feel like I get lost in the echo chamber of assuming everyone's on the same page that we are. But there's just so many people that aren't in the work.
Yeah.
Let me see if there's any more.
I love the one. I don't know if you just said this one, but I love what Holly said about how many kids cannot identify strengths within themselves.
Yeah, I thought that was a big one too.
Yeah.
And even thinking about us as youth workers being able to identify their strengths. I mentioned something about self-fulfilling prophecies, but
Yeah.
kids will rise to the expectations that you give them. And so like being aware of their strengths and helping them understand their strengths is a way to help them build those strengths even further.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's it. We'll if there's any other question. Oh wait, a question just came through. Why is mental health kept separate from physical health? You can't have physical health without mental health, but you can have positive mental health without being healthy. Why isn't this grouped as one? I think that's a very good question.
I think that's exactly what this whole conversation today is. Why don't we talk about it's health? It's body health, right? That's exactly it. When we talk with our families about it, when we're going in to talk with our own doctors, I was just having this conversation recently about there was something that had come up in conversation, postpartum kind of conversations. And it's, why isn't this more out there? Why aren't these conversations happening? Because all of this is happening in our body after you have a baby. It's your whole body's a mess, right? Your hormones are affecting your brain. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about how much our hormones affect our brain unless you're in puberty, right? It should be the whole body approach. And that's exactly what I'm hoping we can start moving to as we have more of these conversations. I'm so glad that IYI brought this conversation, because if we can start pushing this out and having those conversations, you're exactly right. It should be a full body approach.
Yeah, especially because there are even times when your body will be like physically manifesting anxiety and you might not even be feeling it in your brain. So it goes the opposite way too.
Yep.
Another question. A couple comments. I work at a local high school and so many students are shocked when I share my own mental health struggles. Conversations are important. There was one question, and this will be the last one just based on time. Do you feel like social media has impacted mental health in a positive or negative way?
I actually do. I actually have done 2 presentations for IYI on social media and mental health, and it is not good. There's a lot of research about the effects of mental health. There are a lot of youth that are out talking about the effects of mental health, and not in a good way. So yeah, I 100% think that the use of social media and how social media companies are using social media with our youth, it's not good. So yes, I've done a couple presentations on that. That's a big topic of conversation that I have constantly with that. Yeah. And I want to address really quick, Angie made a comment. I really talked about this from just a whole kind of broad spectrum. I didn't even get to the cultural and traditional pieces that come into play when we work with some of the families we work with on stigma. And I think that's a whole nother conversation in itself as well, of how, we have to work with families and where they're at, but that culture and tradition can have a big impact as well.
Yep. Thank you for that. And so Lindsay, if you want to go to the last slide, I'm just gonna go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you all for attending. Lindsay, thank you for that wonderful presentation. As a reminder, a copy of the PowerPoint will be found in the link that we shared. It'll also be emailed out after. Just a reminder, if you could go to the next slide, Lindsay, we have some events coming up. May 17th, trauma sensitive coaching and mentoring. Kind of excited about that one. It's our first real take on athletic coaches and why they should be trauma informed, as well as mentors. We May 2nd and 3rd next week, Advancing Equity Summit. We have close to 25 workshops, 2 keynotes for that. It's no charge for youth workers in Indiana, of course. And then finally, as we conclude, I just want to thank all of the attendees who joined us today. We appreciate your impact and value your voice and the choice you made to learn and participate with IYI today. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought of today's presentation. If you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk, it might be there. And once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of completion. So to get your certificate, you have to fill out the evaluation. And so with that, that concludes our presentation. And on behalf of Indiana's youth, thank you again for showing up today and every day for Indiana's youth. Thank you.